Hey everybody, welcome to our second to last track today for the Health Innovation. We are excited to have two speakers today from Guardant Health, Helmy Eltoukhy and Jennifer Higgins. Helmy is the co-executive officer, and then Jennifer Higgins is the vice president of public affairs. So let's give them a warm welcome as they join the stage.
Good afternoon. I think it's good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Jenn Higgins. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at Guardant Health. I'm joined here today by our co-founder and co-CEO, Dr. Helmy Eltoukhy. Helmy, I'd love to hear more about your journey, but first and foremost, tell us what Guardant Health is and what do you do?
Yeah, so it's nice being here today. It's always enjoy coming into Utah. Guardant is really a precision oncology company, and I would say that we have a three-step approach to conquering cancer. We started with late-stage patients, really helping late-stage patients get onto better treatments through a simple blood test without needing a biopsy. We're now helping cancer survivors. These are patients who had early-stage cancer and were cured, who are worried about their cancer coming back. And we're essentially able to give them quantitative peace of mind with a simple blood test for recurrence monitoring. And the ultimate goal, and something that we're very close to, we're actually launching our first test next year in this area, is screening. This is what you think about when you think about a blood test for cancer. It's been about 10 years in terms of us having that vision, and we're finally coming to its fruition now. It's becoming a reality next year. And so it's going to be really exciting to see how all these tests work together and hopefully make cancer a lot less ominous than it has been.
That's great. So take us back that 10 plus years ago. How did your journey begin as an entrepreneur? I know this is not your first company, but tell us a little bit about how you came to start and found Guardant Health.
Yeah, I started in a very different place. My background is, I think, more akin to the title of this summit. I started in semiconductors, actually, on the engineering side. And I think like most things that have impact, there tends to be a nonlinear kind of pathway to achieving them. And so I always wanted to go into healthcare. I always wanted to help people. My parents had always taught me to leave the world in a better place than you found it. And so I wanted to do something that had high impact. And halfway through my schooling at Stanford, I was there for about 10 years doing an undergrad, master's, PhD. Something really amazing was happening, really the tail end of the Human Genome Project. This is around the year 2000. And so the first human genome had been sequenced for about $3 billion, took 10 years. And clearly, we probably want to sequence more than one genome, in terms of the kind of scientific inquiry and applications to human health. And so the idea was, could you combine all the progress that had been made in semiconductors and apply it to lowering the cost of sequencing? And that became my work for about 5 or 6 years. I started a company that was trying to develop a semiconductor-based sequencing device, essentially a sort of personal computer of DNA sequencing. I sold that to a company that now develops machines where 95% of all DNA in the world is sequenced on their devices. So I was at that company for about 5 years, leading a big part of their research effort. And when I joined, it cost about $1 million to sequence a genome. When I left, it was about $1,000. And there had been all these proclamations about what would happen to human health, to disease, if we reached that $1,000 genome. And so we got there, and it was really more of a whimper than a bang. I think what everyone had forgotten was, the sequence is just information. It's how you apply it. It's the utility piece where a lot of the hard work begins. And so, I decided to leave to really focus my efforts on how do we apply these amazing tools, these amazing technologies that can sequence DNA at such low cost and high bandwidth. How can we apply them to long-standing issues in human health? And that's really the beginnings of my journey at Guardant, really applying next generation sequencing to something that's considered a disease of the genome, which is cancer. I've had a lot of cancer kind of in my family and so on. So it also had a lot of personal meaning to me to be able to really dedicate my life's work to this.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit more? Obviously, I'm not a PhD, I'm not a doctor, but I think when we hear the term next generation sequencing, it becomes a bit intimidating, right? And you talk about all the pieces of the puzzle, machine learning, bioinformatics, et cetera. Can you give people just a high level sense of what it means to capture genomic information from the blood, what you do at Guardant?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the unifying principle of cancer is that it's tissue that's just growing rapidly and growing out of control. Those cells, as they multiply, they're also dying, and they're shedding essentially their unique genetic sequence into the blood. Essentially, why cancer is because there's mutations in the genetic code of those cells. That's why sun damage or smoking, essentially it modifies DNA in those cells or causes damage in DNA of those cells, and that's why it can lead to cancer. And so we developed a technology where we took a lot of analogs from really the wireless communication space, from engineering, where if you think about how good communications have become over the last few decades, better signal to noise, you can have phone calls that have crystal clear signal and fidelity. We applied a lot of those same principles to the problem of how do you find these trace tiny remnants of DNA that are coming from a tumor somewhere in the body. How do you find that in a single tube of blood? And that's really the beginnings of the technology. And the way it works is essentially there are these fragments that are being shed, and they're at very low concentrations in a tube of blood. And so we developed technology, biochemistry that can convert that DNA into something that can be sequenced in almost a lossless sort of way. And then we developed informatics on the back end that can improve the error rate of sequencing technologies by over 1,000-fold. Mm-hmm. And so we could see those signals with very high accuracy.
So that's the secret sauce, if you will, which is that you're able to reduce that error rate in a way that maximizes the ability to have an accurate picture of genomic information in the blood, maybe compared to what technology was doing before.
Exactly. And then the more that we sequence, and the reason we started with late-stage diseases, we wanted to understand what the signals of stage 3, stage 4 cancer look like in blood. And as we collected more and more data, we could improve signal to noise, get to stage 1, stage 2, and then eventually early detection.
And presumably advanced cancer or late-stage cancer has more of that signal in the blood.
Yeah, if you think about it, late-stage tumors are larger, they're metastatic, and so on. So there's a correlation between stage of cancer and how high the signals are in blood.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about a drop of blood, right? We're talking about multiple milliliters of blood that you would take like in a doctor's office?
Yeah, I think there are a few companies that tried that. It didn't work very well. So,
that's great. Let's go back a little bit to Guardant in terms of starting the company. You founded the company with Amir Ali Talazaz. I'm interested to know more about the journey from starting that company 10 years ago with, I would assume, just a couple of employees, like a typical sort of startup in Silicon Valley, to where you are today. Can you talk a bit about that journey from starting the company over the past 10 years, going public, building an international footprint as opposed to just being a US-based company, the number of employees, the number of products? Talk about that growth and how it's excited you, but what it's looked like over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things when you're in the middle of it, you don't realize it's happening. You're always focused on kind of that next milestone, next product launch, next application, next publication, getting reimbursement and so on. And then you take a step back and you kind of look at what you've achieved, and it's always impressive if you're on that right path. I would say that despite everything we've done over the last 10 years, we still feel like we're scratching the surface. We've been public, for 3 years now. It just still feels like we're a startup in many ways, just because we're really starting to see all those pieces come together. We're laying that foundation in terms of what we think of as the hardware layer, in terms of all of these tests, in late stage and recurrence monitoring, and early detection that are really providing the data. One of the big challenges in healthcare in general is that it's very data starved. There's just not enough data that we're getting. So we think about applying machine learning, all these things, but you need data, you need outcomes, you need structured data that's labeled to be able to make those insights. And that's what these tests are doing. A lot of these tests that we've launched and some of the ones that we're about to launch are probably the most complicated diagnostic tests ever launched in terms of the amount of data that's going to be generated from each and every single patient. And I think the important things about that is that it's going to allow us to improve these tests at an accelerating rate. And I think we're going to see analogs of how we're going from this, I would say, primary layer of just having sort of the hardware layer. We're now going to the application layer. And then eventually we're going to this network layer where these tests are all working together. There's really going to be nonlinear value creation from essentially how these tests work with one another and the type of prediction we can make in terms of an individual person's outcomes in the future. It's really an exciting time point.
No, I think that's fantastic. One of the things that you talked about at the outset was this idea of being across the sort of continuum of care. Can you talk a little bit about the thought process behind starting with advanced cancer? You talked a little bit about the fact that there's different signals that are coming through, but the point you made about data, I think, is a compelling one because there are companies out there that are probably doing it the other way around, right? They're starting with this sort of screening with a limited amount of data, sort of an application that seems like it has tremendous value, but it does in the context of what you're trying to accomplish, which is gathering that information to make hopefully a more refined product in the end that will help more people.
Yeah, no, it is a little bit counterintuitive. Why would you start with late-stage disease if you're going towards, early detection, and that's essentially your ultimate goal. One of the values we have at Guardant is intellectual humility. Coming from engineering and coming from the tech side, we learned the hard way in terms of how humbling biology can be, how complicated healthcare is. And really by starting in the areas that you can provide the most value, in the areas where you can essentially help patients first, those that are most in need, is kind of the methodology that we came by. And so if you think about a late-stage patient, stage 3, stage 4, the disease burden is higher, the signals are higher, but they're also the patients that are most in need in terms of getting to treatment. If you think about reimbursement, obviously a lot of these patients are on very expensive drugs. So even from a business model point of view, there's a endpoint that is much nearer term in terms of being able to actually build a successful product. And so our viewpoint was, let's learn by doing. Let's essentially hit a whole bunch of singles and just keep going at it really in this sort of unstoppable way until we get to early detection. And so it's been pretty amazing to see the amount of data that we're able to unlock now. We've sequenced, I think, almost 250,000 cancer patients. That data has been very instrumental in providing, improving the technology in terms of providing higher sensitivity, higher specificity, in terms of launching new products, in terms of the recurrence monitoring, and soon to be early detection. So it really did play out, and the beauty of it is that you have a sustainable, thriving business while you're still learning, and it's that business is driving the research.
So that's your engine that's fueling the future of the company when you talk about screening and early detection.
Exactly.
Can you tell us, can we drill a little deeper on this? We use the term liquid biopsy, and again, similar to next generation sequencing. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of typical journey of an advanced cancer patient, the way that it was and the way that it probably should be in terms of how Guardant and the work that you're doing is benefiting those patients in terms of giving them opportunities and time?
Yeah, so I would say that one of the areas our test has made a dramatic difference is for essentially advanced non-small cell lung cancer patients. So someone with lung cancer, most of them are diagnosed stage 3, stage 4, and our test is now, I think, testing over 20% of all US lung cancer patients. And before, if a patient got diagnosed, they would essentially need a lung biopsy. A lung biopsy costs about $14,000, has a 19% complication rate, and a 1% mortality rate. We've essentially been able to replace a repeat biopsy in a lung cancer patient with a simple blood draw. So not only is it saving a lot of money to the system, it's essentially getting patients on treatment much more quickly. Typically, if you have to do a tissue biopsy-based approach, it can take anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 weeks to get results back. With our test, we're turning results in about 5 days. And obviously, adverse events of a blood draw are essentially non-existent. So it's been pretty dramatic. And this is, I think, one of the few places where it's been a win-win-win, where it's a win for, obviously the physicians, for patients, and for payers as well. We're essentially reducing cost and improving outcomes with this technology.
So when you talk about that, that time that you wait for tissue biopsy, you've just been told that you have a late-stage cancer, and then you wait maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks for a path result that comes back. Oftentimes that patient gets put on chemotherapy or radiation. The value of getting someone on a targeted therapy, again, to your point, is significant. It sounds like not only are you saving money, but you're also reducing that time that patient has to wait to get on a therapy, and you're hopefully lowering their ability to have risk from a procedure that they maybe didn't need by getting a result through a blood option. Why isn't everybody doing this? Why isn't every oncologist in America doing this for every late-stage cancer patient? And why isn't every payer paying for it?
No, we think it's almost malpractice if a patient's not getting it. Just to put it into perspective, you hit some good points, which is what is the difference between putting a patient on the right treatment versus the wrong treatment? So on basically a genomically targeted therapy, a lot of these new therapies that are, have been approved over the last few years versus just standard chemotherapy. It's about a 3x difference in survival. So average 12 months for a lung cancer patient versus potentially 2 to 3 years in terms of high quality survival. So these are dramatic effects in terms of putting patients in the right treatment. Even when patients are sequenced through tissue, 50% of the time they're just put on, as you say, kind of random chemotherapy rather than the right treatment. And so it's really a travesty that that this kind of is happening. We've spent a lot of efforts. You've spearheaded obviously a lot of our work in terms of working with patient advocacy groups, working with other stakeholders, as well, payers and patients and physicians, and legislators to really try to make sure that no patient is left behind. There are too many patients right now that are not getting guideline recommended treatment. Clinical practice is at, unfortunately, a level that is not what patients should be getting.
So can we talk a little bit about not lung cancer? Because I think it's also important for people to know that this first foray into non-small cell lung cancer is important, but you have an FDA-approved product, the first ever FDA-approved product in this space, that's got applications for all solid tumor cancers. Can you talk a little bit about why we're talking lung cancer now, but that there are obviously other cancers where late-stage patients can benefit from this?
Lung cancer, at least for late-stage disease, is a sort of a canary in the coal mine in terms of the number of therapies that have been approved, both targeted therapies, immunotherapies, and so on. But almost every other cancer type is following that same approach. And so what's happening for lung cancer today will be happening for breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer tomorrow. We're already starting to see that. Guardant 360 is the first FDA-approved liquid biopsy. It's essentially approved for all solid tumor cancers. And so this is really a framework, it's a paradigm shift that will essentially apply to all these cancer types and hopefully usher in a new era of, I would say, much more proactive treatment and much better outcomes for patients.
So as more guidelines come forward, more targeted therapies come to bear, there's continued applications for Guardant 360 and for products that are helping to support patients getting on that right treatment.
Yeah, the beauty of it is we're looking at broad sections of the genome. So this is not like a test that gets outdated in a couple of years, is only looking at a narrow pathway. As more drugs get approved, essentially Guardant 360 will be able to essentially steer patients into those potential therapies. So it is something, we think of this era, we used to think of companion diagnostics, so diagnostics that are companions for specific drugs. This is a new area of universal diagnostics, and maybe companion therapeutics. And so this is really an exciting development. It's what's called precision oncology. And we also think this will apply to other disease areas in the future as well. This is just, I think, a preview of what's to come.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention too, I think precision oncology, precision medicine, we hear about the ability to really hone in on those treatments, and that's being very much driven by the biopharmaceutical industry. Can you talk a little bit about your interactions as a company, how you're sharing information, how you're partnering on these companion diagnostics and clinical trials? Because I think that's another important layer of this beyond just the engagement with oncologists, the value of the work that your company's doing in support of those treatments and those therapies that are coming to bear.
Yeah, we work with pretty much, the who's who of pharmaceutical companies out there, over 80 of them. And essentially what we're trying to do is, there are two sides of the picture. It's, how do you find those patients and, the right patients and put them to the right clinical trials? It turns out that only something like, less than 5% of patients are matched to clinical trials. So it's kind of terrible. If you look at pediatric cancers, on the other hand, about 90% of cancer kids are essentially matched to clinical trials. So it's a night and day between adults and kids, and we'd hope that it gets to something, in terms of what, 80%, 90% in terms of what it is for pediatric cancers. And one of the challenges is, how do you find that needle in a haystack? How do you find that patient that has that specific, type of cancer, that specific mutation driving their cancer, and put them into this, trial? And the beauty of, our test being out there is that not only are we, finding, potential patients for existing FDA-approved drugs, we're also finding them for the next generation of drugs that are currently in clinical trials. So we're helping our pharma partners essentially find those patients. We're helping those patients get to the right trials, and hopefully we're all working together to really usher in, hopefully, the next wave of new drugs and next generation treatment.
Yeah, as somebody who spends a lot of time with patients and patient advocacy groups, I recognize that the work that you do is important in the sense that so many patients, when they're newly diagnosed with cancer, are not able just to go on clinicaltrials.gov and find the place they need to be to get this information. And so providing that data and information, not just to pharma, not just to oncologists, but to patients as well, as a guidepost or a supporter, I think is really important. So it's hard to know just off the top of your head where to go next. And so I think it's good to know that your company's steering people in that direction. Can we talk a little bit about sort of COVID for a minute? Obviously, COVID-19 and the global pandemic had an impact on many companies and had a tremendous impact on healthcare, but it also had a tremendous impact on cancer screening. Can you talk a little bit about not only how Guardant had to adapt or maybe took advantage of the fact that we had a mechanism by which to get patients information about their cancer during a global pandemic, but also the potential applications of that for people who want and need to get screened for cancer?
Yeah, no, access is difficult. Access to the best possible treatments, even in normal times, as we've talked about. And certainly the pandemic exacerbated all of that. One of the challenges is if an existing cancer patient had about a 30 to 40% mortality rate with COVID. So if you think about, shelter in place or being locked down, oncologists were very vigilant about making sure that their patients stayed indoors, stayed at home, really leveraged telemedicine, and we did the same. So I would say that when you have a technology like ours, which is a simple blood test where you don't need surgery, you don't need a biopsy, it is something that I think was very important to utilize during the pandemic. So we have mobile phlebotomists that are able to go out to a patient's home, do the blood draws, perform the blood draws, and get that information to the physician so that they can put the patient on the right treatments. And so that was something that a lot of physicians leaned on heavily during this time. And I think it also is a harbinger to essentially how liquid biopsy and how our tests will impact other areas where access is very difficult. If you think about screening during the pandemic, there are reports that screening rates, dropped, well over 90%. And what that is doing is it's going to cause a bolus of a lot of late-stage diagnoses. A lot more people are going to die because they weren't screened during these last 18 months. And if instead there was a blood test that could have been performed, that could have been performed at a patient's home, I think the effects wouldn't have been quite as bad as they have been. The other issue too is that compliance is extremely low, right? With these, with a lot of the tools out there. I mean, who wants to get a colonoscopy and spend 2 days out of work? Even radiographic imaging, whether it's a CT scan or a mammogram and so on, is somewhat unpleasant. And being able to have a blood test that is as simple as doing a cholesterol test, I think is going to be a game changer.
Absolutely. I think that's the vision. Can you talk a little bit about the trial that you have underway and sort of what the future of cancer screening looks like for Guardant Health?
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about starting with late stage and growing the company and growing our capabilities is just our ability to invest in trials has grown exponentially as well. So we launched a 13,000 patient trial a couple of years ago called Eclipse. And this is basically trying to validate the first indication of our screening test. So instead of getting a colonoscopy for colorectal screening, someone could get a blood test for that. And so this trial, I think, will finish enrollment later this year. So we're really in the final stretches. And hopefully we'll have we'll be able to read those results out next year. We'll have what's called a lab-developed test version of it next year, and then hopefully an FDA-approved version of it in early 2023.
Do you see benefits for this type of cancer screening for certain populations based on what you know about who's getting screened now and who's not?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, just if you think about health equity and health disparities, right now for colorectal cancer screening, there's been a bunch of national initiatives to try to get screening and compliance to above 80%, and we've really been flatlined at the high 60s, 67, 68%. And if you look at the tests that are out there, it's colonoscopy, which, as I said, is, you have to do a day of prep and then a day for the colonoscopy. Just not a lot of people can take 2 days off of work. And as someone who's had a colonoscopy, you may do it the first time, but you're just really reluctant to go through that process again. Other tests that are out there are stool tests, which also just are very unpalatable. They're not, really something that is, very simple to administer. Versus, a blood test fits what's called an opportunistic screening modality, which means that you could just be in the doctor's office, for your annual physical. You're getting your labs, you're getting your vitamin D test, you're getting a cholesterol test, and they can say, oh look, you're out of date for screening. We'll just tack on this blood test. And so you look at the types of screening, let's say PSA screening for prostate cancer, where you have that ability, you tend to get to nearly 90% or even above 90% compliance, and that really is going to be a game changer.
No, I think that's it's interesting because we recognize that there are some natural barriers in the healthcare system, and so removing those through that opportunistic screening becomes a game changer, hopefully, for a number of people. And I know folks, at least that I talk to, are excited about the prospects of that. Looking ahead to the future, can you talk for a minute about sort of how you see cancer care evolving over the next 5 to 10 years, and what would it look like in a perfect world, at Guardant as part of that, but more broadly, what does it look like when we look at across the continuum of cancer care, the future of cancer in this country?
Yeah, so this is a critical inflection point in the company. I think it feels like we've accomplished a lot, but at the same time, it feels like we're just scratching the surface, as I said before. We're now going to have all of these tests that are spanning the continuum. These tests will continue to expand in terms of the types of cancer we're testing for, how they work together. But I think that data piece that we're unlocking is going to drive this era where instead of we're mostly flying blind these days when we think about cancer. You think about it's something that's going on inside your body. You don't know where it is. You don't even know if it's there or not. And even when you have it, it's very hard to get into information in terms of what's going on, what's driving it, why is this drug working, if I try this drug, what will happen in the future. But as we get all of that data and we see how that data connects not just to that individual, but to potential outcomes, we create a closed feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And that closed feedback loop is going to drive what I think is an era where we have something like Waze, kind of navigation for cancer care. And in general for just, disease, prevention, as well as making sure that we maintain wellness. And I think that's the exciting part. We're going to go from this hardware era to this application kind of software era in the very near future.
Do providers understand this? Do you think that they see the sort of promise of the innovation that you're describing? Because I think when we think of cancer care and even healthcare, it feels very fragmented at times, right? It feels like all of those pieces aren't in one place for us, and that connectivity across that spectrum of information from the date of diagnosis all the way through to that treatment and the post-treatment and monitoring the treatment. Do you think that there's work to be done in terms of that, generating that awareness and education? I know you've done a ton of work with oncologists and cancer centers, but is that a barrier you still see, or do you think that it's going to take time? Does it take resources? Does it take an educational campaign? What is it that's will get us there faster, I guess, is the best way of asking.
It's all of the above. Unfortunately, healthcare, doesn't have the same adoption curves that consumer products, have. It's slow, it's painful. It's why, a lot of the large companies, tech companies that have tried to do things in healthcare that have been transformative have frankly failed. It's a land of entrenched incumbents. There was a study that looked at how long does it take for a new innovation that gets into guidelines to be part of the clinical care practice. The half-life is about in terms of 50% of physicians adopting new practice, it's about 7 years. So, we think of this as wave fronts that we're launching. Essentially, a lot of what I'm describing are many wave fronts that are many kind of new innovations that we'll be launching. But we're still even in the early innings of the first product that we launched in 2014. There are still more physicians that don't use those types of technologies than who do use it. We're starting to get to that 40-50% number in terms of physicians using these innovations, but that 7-year half-life kind of holds true, unfortunately.
I think that we're hopefully moving faster than the thermometer when doctors were not so much ready to do that. Took about 100 years for someone to figure out you could use mercury to tell someone's temperature rather than putting your hands on their forehead. So we're doing a little better job than maybe the thermometer in Fahrenheit. My last question, I guess, from the standpoint of sort of pulling all this together is, in terms of biomedical innovation and the work that you've done in healthcare and engineering, et cetera, as you think about starting one company, starting a second company, taking it public, seeing, like you said, being in the middle of it, seeing that innovation and growth, do you have advice for people who are looking to sort of have their own kind of impact professionally and from an entrepreneurial standpoint?
Yeah, I would say that, I made the journey from tech to healthcare, and on the technology side, especially coming from an engineering background, you're often very focused on the technological innovation, the 5x, 10x better, and so on. And unfortunately, healthcare is a graveyard of a lot of great technologies that never really made it into the clinic. And that's because often the more critical element is not the technological innovation, it's a business model innovation. It's how is the test actually reimbursed, how is it paid for, and so on. So I would say that is probably as critical or even a more critical element of a business plan in healthcare than in the technology side.
That's great. Well, I appreciate your time and opportunity to have this chance to chat with you. I would love to see if there are any questions from the audience for Helmy, and happy to sort of take those as we wrap up. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Just curious on the screening side, as you guys move into screening, a couple of things come up. Obviously, you mentioned disease burden goes way down. How do you deal with the kind of sensitivity of that test? How do you improve it? And kind of on a similar front, how do you deal with the tissue of origin question, knowing, if you find a mutation, where it came from?
That's a great question. So, we've layered on, I would say, more biomarkers in terms of what we're looking at in the blood. So if you think about DNA, it's 3 billion letters. A lot of what we were looking at is how those letters changed, basically how they got mutated. Now we're looking at essentially chemical modifications of that DNA. So there's something called methylation. And we're also looking at structural changes of the DNA, how that DNA is wrapped around these protein balls that keep DNA intact. And it turns out all of those elements, with the exception of the mutations, change from cell type to cell type, from cancer cell to normal cells. The reason that your liver cells are different than your skin cells and so on, even though they have the same DNA sequence, is because of methylation and some of these chemical changes. And so we're able to hit multiple birds with one stone. We're able to improve the sensitivity dramatically by layering on these other modalities, these other dimensions of DNA. But we're also able to look at tissue of origin as well and infer with reasonable accuracy where the cancer may be coming from.
So in the end, you talked about the resistance within the system and the 7-year half-life for doctors actually to adopt new technologies. So what's your advice for doctors and how they can keep an open mind for these technologies, how they can stay up to date with it? It's
difficult. There are NCCN guidelines that are specific to each cancer type, and you may go to an academic cancer center, and a lot of these doctors specialize. There's a lung cancer doctor and so on. But in the community, where 80% of patients are treated, they're generalists. They're looking at everything from breast cancer, lung cancer, sarcomas, and so on. So it's hard, and that's where I think technologies like ours are really helpful, because we put it all in one place. We have all the interpretation in terms of what this mutation means and what are the drugs that are there. So I think increasingly there's going to have to be better tools, better informatics tools, better clinical decision support tools that are out there just to make sure that physicians can keep up. I think most of them have the best of intentions. They really are heroes of the front lines in terms of the work they do. We've just seen an explosion in terms of the types of drugs, new treatments, and the amount of information that's there. And just like anything, I think new tools will help.
I'm an interventional radiologist, so if you can get rid of lung biopsies, I will hug you. Even in the era of no hugging, I will find and hug you. They are atrocious, so you definitely have our support. I do have a couple questions, and I think one of them got answered with that gentleman's question over there, but if you're dealing with multiple primaries, are you able to pick that up, do the methylation patterns? So it's not unreal or unrealistic that I biopsy a lung, and lo and behold, we find something somewhere else, which is a second primary. So that's question one. Question two would be the cost. I'm surprised to hear it's $14,000. I get like a single-digit return on that. So that is kind of shocking to me that it's that expensive. And how do you stack up at cost? The other question, which I think kind of relates into these, is we're sort of beholden to data. We can't chase all the shiny things. Not that we don't want to, but we hurt people. Sometimes we get a little too exuberant about adopting things that haven't been proven.
Yeah.
So, have you guys moved forward with trials, testing your outcomes versus the outcomes of a standard biopsy? I think those three pieces were pretty key for me. And the last piece is, I know we kind of focused on, you mentioned stage 3, stage 4. Yeah. Typically, if we're dealing with stage 4, I'm probably biopsying the met.
Sure.
Rather than the primary, so I'm staying out of the lung if I can. But if we could get to the earlier stage, that would be really awesome. And has that been examined from your standpoint? Because again, my understanding can be that once you develop the metastasis, the genetic variation is what led to the metastasis, so it might actually be different than the primary. So I don't know if you've seen difference in the sensitivity of your tests between those.
Yeah,
sorry, a lot of questions.
Great questions. So the first one, we see these tools as being used in an ecosystem. So I think radiographic imaging is going to have to be complementary. And so we're, detecting that the disease is still there. maybe detecting what kind of disease it is, but in terms of localizing or seeing that there are multiple primaries and so on, that's where we really need a symbiosis with a CT scan or so on. So I think that'll be difficult to do to really see that there are multiple primaries there. Although we do see the heterogeneity that's there. So we could see different mutations driving different disease. You can see the drugs working on one clone and not the others. So there is an ability to do some of that. Let's see, I have to now remember the question. So the second one was...
Next one, cost.
Yeah, cost. So the $14,000 kind of rate for a tissue biopsy is when you factor in complications. So a normal biopsy is maybe a few $1,000s if everything goes right. But when you look at puncturing the lungs, having a pneumothorax and so on, those are like $50,000 biopsies because of the hospitalization. And so when you average everything, this is a publication we worked on with, I think this was forget the gentleman's name, but it was Ohio State University, and this is maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and everyone was very surprised. But we looked at Medicare claims, millions of them, and basically looked at the health economics of that. And if you compare that to the cost of our test, it's really the biopsy versus the blood draw, which blood draw is $12. Essentially, you still have to sequence the material you get from the tumor, or you do a sequencing. We're about the same price as these sequencing panels that are out there, which is a few $1,000s. So that's on top of the $14,000 that is there. And then the last point in terms of stage 3, stage 4, that was our first test. We have 3 indications we're going after. So there's about 1 million late-stage patients. That's where our FDA-approved product, Guardant 360, is used. We have about 200 peer-reviewed publications there. We've done a number of clinical utility outcome studies, interventional studies, to demonstrate exactly that the performance is not inferior to a tissue biopsy-based approach. We have the second indication that we're working on. There are about 15 million cancer survivors in the United States, and that's about using the test in the earlier stage setting, stage 1 through stage 3, where patients are going through curative resection. You're making the decision on whether to apply adjuvant therapy, so escalation or de-escalation of treatment, as well as looking at recurrence monitoring for those individuals. And then finally, this 13,000 patient trial we have ongoing, that's for average risk asymptomatic individuals. So that's really about detecting cancer at its earliest stages. Right now we're starting with colorectal disease, but we'll be expanding into multiple cancer types as well and doing the same kind of studies.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to hear that you guys are priced, because we send so many studies out, specimens out already for routine genetic analysis that you're really not adding cost. You're just saving it.
We're saving it, and we're saving the complication rate, and it's faster. It's like 3 times faster. So.
Thank you.
We could take one more question, maybe. Over here.
Hi. Just any advice you have for people who work in tech but are interested in more of the biology field?
Yeah, I would just say, learn a lot, read a lot, and then follow kind of what you're passionate about in terms of area of health. Healthcare is so broad. There's digital health. There's therapeutics. There's diagnostics. You can work on software in terms of electronic health records, EMR, and so on. So, if you're going to do something, make sure it's something that you're proud of working on, that you feel like the impact is going to be meaningful, and then try a whole bunch of different things, just like anything else, just like going to college and picking a major. It's the same thing on the healthcare side. You have to learn by doing and kind of jumping into it.
All right. Well, let's give one last round of applause to our speakers.
Thank you.